Morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's here, regardless of where you are. My name is Wael Ghandour. I have been, as of late, a security engineer at VMware. I have a background in networking and security. And Saad, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Sar. I've been a DevOps engineer at MIT with open learning for probably 7, 8 years. Prior to that, I was in IT, played different IT roles. A lot of it focused on end user computing. But yeah, the last 6, 7 years has been strictly DevOps side of the house.
Yeah. And we both gave a course earlier this year at UpLimit in the Foundations of Security Engineering. And today, I'd like to talk to you about the choices you have when starting out in security. There's this saying of build it and they come, and that's in reference to building products that tend to do well. And of course, you build something that fulfills, like solves a problem. Your audience, you'll eventually, hopefully, have customers, but you'll inevitably have vulnerabilities as well. And one of the things we'd like you to think about is as you consider a journey in security, or maybe you're not intending on going full time in security, but you want to incorporate security practices in your daily function, is that how to best address those. And the choices usually go something like this. Most think that this is the way to go forward. And obviously, this is a dramatization of taking an offensive approach to security, which is usually via penetration testing, which we like to think of as demolition, versus taking this approach. And this isn't really about which one is better. What we would like you to consider is what is a better approach if you're just starting out from a learning standpoint. Where are you better off learning? Is it to teach you the basics of explosives, where to place charges, how to break into a building, what tools you use? Or is it, do we start by talking about material science, how to build the foundations of a building? How do you secure who's going in and out of it? The power systems, the grid, the wiring, all of that stuff. And look, if you are already making hundreds of thousands of dollars finding amazing vulnerabilities, then you're obviously not the typical audience for this talk. You're well on your way. So we would probably learn more from you. But if you are like many of us considering what you want to do and the obvious choice isn't apparent to you, then this is something that might benefit you. Dad, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think I can add a bit to go on that building and materials analogy. So if you're looking at it from the outside perspective looking in, so you're trying to break into this building physically, and you have a window that you're trying to climb through or figure your way around. If you've never seen a window, you don't know how a window works to begin with, your only option is either get a tool that you saw someone use and break the glass and climb through, and that's the only way you can think about it. But most likely, you wouldn't even try to open it and see if it's even locked to begin with, just because you don't know how a window operates. So it's just looking at it from, as a newbie, looking at it from that perspective, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you started out with designing the structure itself, you had to figure out what kind of windows you have to install, how windows work, where do you install the windows, what kind of locking mechanisms those windows have. That's the perspective of the insider looking out. Then when you're on the outside, you can clearly tell, oh, I can try this. Maybe it has this type of lock. Maybe they forgot to lock it to begin with, and I can just open it without really breaking any glass or turning on any alerts or anything like that. So the perspective is very different, but it changes a lot of things when especially when you're starting out and looking at offensive versus defensive posture.
Yeah. And obviously, if you're an experienced penetration tester or offensive security engineer, depending on the type of engagement, it may not be as much of an outside in kind of thing. For example, in a black box type of testing scenario, you don't have access to source code, you don't have details of systems, and so you are asked to have a complete outsider's look at the system versus in a white box type of engagement where you would be given source code to scrutinize, you would be given some access to systems. So it's not 100%, you're not locked out of the environment completely. But as Saj said, exactly, the perspective is more of an outsider. You're not necessarily part of you were not part of the design process or how this thing came about. So you're poking, you're looking at this lock, you're looking at this window, you're observing who's going in and out of the building, and then you're trying to formulating a game plan based on how you're theorizing the vulnerabilities are. So so I want to share a very high level breakdown of what goes into developing or actually developing, building, and running a secure product or service. And you can see, and of course, some may take issue with this and saying, hey, where's this? Where's that? Where's incident response? Absolutely. But this is just to show you that penetration testing or the subset of security practice that is focused on offensive approaches is just one slice of the bigger picture. And what that leaves you with is that there's enormous opportunity for those who maybe are not necessarily interested in doing offensive work right off the bat. So I was one of those people. I was always very interested in security. And while I did dabble with offensive stuff early on, it didn't interest me as much. And then I came back into it when things took off with virtual infrastructure and programmatic infrastructure. That's when I started thinking that, hey, there's room for more defensive approaches to build security in. And so it's a full picture, right? So secure development is a huge chunk of it, which means you have to develop securely, you have to write secure code, you have to minimize risk from third-party software that you're importing into your project, and so on and so forth. You want to conduct extensive threat modeling so you understand, what threats face the product or system or component that you're building. Who are the threat actors? What are the vectors, the attack vectors that might exist? And then for secure design, that's your opportunity to build the right things in from the get-go and not discover things after shipping or launching. And then secure operations is once you build and launch this thing, how do you maintain it in a reasonably secure fashion? How do you monitor it? How do you respond to incidents and so forth? And of course, conducting penetration testing is a way to validate if the entire system is working as supposed to be, right? Because we've seen plenty of examples of firms that think they're doing everything right. They have compliance certifications and whatnot. And then you have an attacker that has a completely fresh perspective on this. They're not constrained by the rules of how the system is meant to operate. And then they just find the most embarrassing vulnerabilities. Okay, so that's why it's very important validation. Before I move on, Saad, anything to add there? Any thoughts?
Yeah, we also have to admit that, especially for someone starting off, if you're on the offensive side, it's cooler, it's more interesting. You're breaking into something, you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. It's definitely more inviting or more appealing for someone starting off as opposed to building something on solid grounds and it's secure and it's safe and all that. But you'll never really know unless someone actually tests it out and verifies that. Yeah, it's more inviting. But the one thing we've noticed over the years too is when you go down the offensive side of things without a true understanding of a system and how the components work and interact with one another, what typically happens is you just end up searching for different tools. You use a tool, you're basically clicking buttons because that's how you're trying to break into something, or that's how you think you should be doing it. And so you're having the tool is operating you as opposed to you operating the tool, because you just don't really know what you're doing. One of the things I remember my dad used to make fun of people when they're walking their dogs. You'd see a dog walking and like they're on the leash and the person behind them, they're letting the dog walk the person instead of you being the dog walker. So in a sense, that's how it is. You're just bound to the tool and the tool is operating you. And so without that deep understanding of how things should work, that's where you end up getting stuck in. And the other issue with that too is if something minor changes, you don't really know how to go about changing your side of things to actually. So I'll give you an example. If let's say there's some user input validation and they're checking for a single word, and that's the tool that you have checks for the word. They add some complexity because they realize, oh, they're checking for this word, and they maybe add a letter to the word. Your tool fails because it just doesn't work anymore. But had you known how things work, you can sidestep that and figure your way in. But since you're just on the outside looking in, you're just following what the tool tells you. It'll just go through and your penetration testing would fail, or you just can't get in and you have to find another way around.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just counter though that you have different levels or different skill sets of penetration testers. There are some 100% like you're saying, so they're just running by what the tool is doing. They don't quite know. They don't have that in-depth understanding. And some folks that go down that route remain at that level. They're just tool users for the most part. And frankly, they don't become very successful, especially with a lot of automated tooling that's just getting better, I would say, over time. But then you have people that do start out because your starting point is going to be the tools, but then you do have the people with the right mindset would say, how does this tool work? And there's a lot of open source tools, and just by trying to understand how the tool works, you're absolutely going to learn about these things. If you've tried to use Nmap or tried to really understand any of the questions, the options of how it scans the networks, you're inevitably going to start understanding more about network protocols, system fingerprint, how different operating systems give away information about what stack they're running, and so on and so forth. But inevitably, starting out, you have to master a whole lot of tools to be productive. And you are taking that kind of approach versus, now, again, nothing prevents you from saying, okay, if I'm scanning, let's just say, the Kubernetes control plane, let me go spend some time understanding more about Kubernetes. And so you can do that. But again, that's usually not the emphasis. And that's where you end up in. And as you said, breaking stuff can sound exciting to people learning versus saying, hey, go read about system architecture or how does this whole thing work. Now, depending on your individual preferences, some people may actually be more interested in that. So that's besides the point, because we're just arguing what makes more sense to learn first. And regardless of what you ultimately end up doing, we think that focusing on building foundational knowledge before you get into exploitation is going to benefit you more in the long term. And so aim to acquire a deep understanding of systems and architectures, because this will give you a very good view of the sort of design flaws that exist. What sorts of mistakes do we typically make when designing and building systems? The second point, the cool thing about taking a defensive approach is it's an accelerated path towards being able to contribute. And what I'm trying to say with that is, you join a company, you're in a specific role. If you put on the defender's approach on, there's just tons of problems in any company in relation to their security posture. That's a fact, unfortunately. And so what that means is you have a lot of opportunities to contribute, because most of the security issues that typically exist are quite basic, actually, because they require some discipline to solve. They're usually not addressed immediately. That kind of debt starts to build up, and then companies find themselves in that situation. So if you are trying to approach, you have opportunities to patch systems, mitigate vulnerabilities, improving the security posture by looking at how systems are being configured by default, and ultimately maintaining safety of that product or service. Versus if you're starting out as a penetration tester, it takes time to start finding quality issues. The other thing is, sure, you might find issues, but you're also not necessarily focused on proposing fixes because you're laser focused on finding problems and then moving on to the next one, filing a report. Versus someone on the defensive side, you find the flaw, you want to come with a solution, with a fix. You tend to have a broader the system and what's involved. So you're going to have a different approach there, and I think you're going to have room to contribute much faster than if you were on the offensive side. That any input there?
Yeah, and to harp a bit on that, take it from just a very practical perspective. If you go to your manager or even a coworker and say, "Hey, I've discovered," and it doesn't have to be security related or even IT related in that sense. "Hey, I found this problem and I think we can solve this with those following options. I think that's the best route forward." So how do you expect your manager or your coworker is going to respond? They're going to love that stuff because you found the problem and you're proposing solutions. It's not that you're coming with a problem and you expect someone else to solve it. So that would help you career-wise in a sense too, because you're helping fix the problem. You're just not filing reports, like I said, and you're just moving on to the next one.
The next point is market demand. So if any of you have looked into getting into security, I'm sure you're flooded with courses around how to secure systems, but usually the focus tends to be on the offensive side, ethical hacking, and all of that stuff. And if any of you have come across this concept of bug bounty programs, then that means basically that companies that need talented penetration testers, instead of hiring them or signing up with an individual consultancy or company to have them try to attack their systems, there's a marketplace, if you will, for folks with offensive security skills, and there's just plenty of people doing this work. Of course, they're not all top hackers, but the point is it's easy to have a program like that and have a bunch of offensive security testers take a look at your systems. Versus on the defensive side, there is no such equivalent. There is no defensive bounty market for people that will go through your infrastructure methodically, and your code and whatnot. And the more dependence we have on complex systems, and we're only seeing an acceleration of that, the bigger the need is going to be for defensive skill sets. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's because addressing these issues later is much costlier. It can be much more embarrassing to the company, and frankly, it's much more impactful to customers and their data. In order to take care of things and prevent or minimize the likelihood of these security incidents happening, you want to start that process early, and that starts with largely your defensive talent, or basically anyone handling your systems and having a defensive mindset. So even just from a market demand standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense to start out by building defensive skills there. Any thoughts before I move on to the next point?
Again, to emphasize that whole idea of defense is probably and should be in more in demand, in a sense of you have a lot to secure, and whoever is doing the penetration test, they only have to find one small thing, and then you might be in trouble. But from a defensive posture, especially now with the complexity of systems and all that, there's a ton of things you have to take into consideration and figure out how to actually secure based on your use cases. And so it's definitely a more impactful position to be in from the defensive standpoint.
Yeah, I think there's a gap, right? Because for some time, offensive security also maybe wasn't that prevalent, and you had just a handful of people doing that awesome work, right? Because people would just implicitly trust systems and think that, oh, everything's great. And then you have someone that's thinking out of the box and says, oh, let me try this, let me try that, and then exposing all of these issues. It's something absolutely necessary, but I think we are now at a point where we can say that, okay, we do have substantial resources focused on penetration testing, and I don't think we have an equivalent amount of people having those defensive skills on the builder side. And so this one I think is important because yes, the offensive side is exciting. You're breaking things. You're thinking out of the box to push the system to its limits and maybe have it do things it's not supposed to do. I would say the defensive side, that approach does instill a sense of responsibility and ethics because ultimately you're trying to be responsible towards your customers, their data. If it's a mission critical system, then you're talking about potential lives there. I would say most systems maybe are not in that category, but sometimes it's hard to predict the ripple effect that one system that's not necessarily mission critical, the dependence that other systems might have on it. I think as you put on your defensive thinking cap, you are trying to instill a sense of responsibility in your teammates as well. Folks writing code maybe sometimes are not considering all the implications of what they're doing, and so you will help bring awareness to this. And I think that that's an important thing. What do you think, Seth, on that point?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, put a focus on losing data or a breach can make or break a company and all that stuff. And while it's very true, but I think the focus is shouldn't be on just purely money. You have this trust relationship between you and your clients or your customers. They're trusting you with, depending on what kind of system you're running, with a lot of very personal data to some. So you have to be very respectful. You have to do your utmost best to protect and ensure that trust that they instill in you and in that whole system. And so from that perspective, it's very important and crucial, other than what huge thing can cause with a security breach and the stock market price of the company and all that. Those are givens, but that trust is crucial and very important from that perspective. You have to do your utmost and be very respectful of that.
We have a question that I'd like us to answer live. Someone's asking that for a complete newbie, we're mostly taught offensive skills, as we were mentioning. Then they were interested in knowing what defensive skills can one leverage instead. We touched on that. In fact, it was the very first slide here where we said acquiring a deep understanding of systems, architectures, and design flaws. And the way you go on about that is by understanding how systems work, depending on the system you're responsible for, acquire an understanding of how that system authenticates its users, where the data is stored, who has access to the system. So if we want to get into the specifics of those, I guess those would be basic security primitives that you would look for in any system that you are trying to build and operate securely. I'm sure some of you may have heard of something called the CIA triad, which stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And those are the three essential properties from which it ripples out of. And as a defensive engineer, you're going to be focused on how do we maintain confidentiality of data within our system. How do our customers communicate with us? What protocols do we use? Are they, obviously you want to use encrypted protocols. Depending on the data that's being handled, you may need multiple layers of encryption. You get into the details of things like the security of the keys. How often do we rotate keys? Where do we store the data? Who has access to the data? Is it our entire team? Is it select people? How do we manage insider threats? What if an admin goes rogue? Does that mean they could bring down the entire company? Or do we have ways to mitigate against that scenario? You get into things like operating system security. Let's say you have 3-4 tiers systems based on different levels of risk and sensitivity. How do you secure those? Those are the sorts of things you focus on. And yeah, I hope that answers the question. And definitely, if any of you have more questions, by all means, feel free to ask and interrupt us. We'd be more than happy to take those.
And
Do
I
you
would
have
add
anything to add there?
Yeah, I would add the 2 points to that. One of them would be, if you haven't taken our course, take that. That would be a good starter, actually. And the other thing too is, just like with everything, any kind of job, once you've started really diving deep into all those topics that Wael mentioned, you slowly start seeing patterns, and those questions start coming up and over again. So whenever you're looking at a system, you start automatically asking those same questions. Okay, is the data between this system and that system, is that encrypted or is it going in clear text? Is the data that's sitting in this storage device, or do we have it encrypted? Who are we sanitizing user input? All those start becoming very basic, and you know when to ask them because you just develop that instinct after a while. But yeah, that comes with some practice and a lot of effort and learning, but it's all doable if you take that mindset and just run with it.
Yeah, I would say if you're not in a security role, you can start by just because you're going to have a good understanding of the system that you manage, or I hope you do. You should have that. And so then you should start thinking about, okay, my system handles this type of data. Do I think we have reasonable security measures in place? And then you can start to build your understanding from there. You start to think, then you can also even incorporate attacker centric sort of approaches and think, okay, what if someone bypasses this? What would happen then? Now, again, you're not looking to break it, but it's good to ask the question of what can possibly go wrong. And that's really the essence of threat modeling. Also something we discuss in the course. Hope that answers the question. Moving on, finally, we just want to say that if you can't beat them, join them, in a sense that even if your goal is to become a really good offensive security engineer, having a defense is absolutely going to help you on that journey for all the reasons that we mentioned above, right? If you understand how the system that you're trying to attack works, and of course ethically here, right? The caveat, anytime we talk about attacking a system here, we're talking about it from an ethical standpoint. It's a system that you either own or you have permission to conduct offensive security testing against. Having a defensive background will make you much more effective. You're going to have certain areas of strength probably, and this is usually what you might focus your attacks on. Because even from a in security, there's multiple areas of specialization because it takes a while to develop a skill set in any of those areas. And so even as an offensive security engineer, you have there's different specialties, different areas to focus on. Some folks focus purely on, say, web application attacks. Others focus on hardware devices. They do a lot of reverse engineering of hardware. Some on the code side, they reverse engineer code. And then you have folks that focus on cloud security or infrastructure security. Regardless of that, having a defensive background first will make you a better offensive security engineer. For example, if you had a background in building infrastructure, then you would probably do great focusing on cloud security, penetrating cloud infrastructure. If you had a developer's background, you probably would find yourself at home going after after web applications or just software in general, reverse engineering, writing exploits. And of course, having your developer background will help you automate a lot of the work. And if you get into offensive security, there's a lot of stuff to automate as you try to ingest data from all of your tools. But having that defensive background will make you much more effective rather than just going off of the tools. And if the tool says, oh, I didn't find anything, you're just going to say, okay, fine. But if you had that background, you understood how systems are built, you might tweak the tool in a way that will make the difference between you and the next offensive security engineer that doesn't have that kind of perspective. And I believe that was the last slide. Saad, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, just to make it a bit concrete, for that last one. So I love basketball and I follow a lot of basketball podcasts and stuff. And one of the thing that kind of came up recently was this really good offensive player that had a long NBA career was talking about how he would naturally, he's a great offensive player because of a lot of practice, a lot of time and effort. But the one thing that kind of made him stand out from other players was he would spend a ton of time watching film on defenses and defensive players and watching their moves, especially when he's playing against them, and how they counteract and how he counteracted one move and then they defended another way and they can't stop them. And so he developed his offense based on a lot of just watching film on all the different defensive moves and defensive tricks that made him become a way better offensive player. And this kind of applies here too, is if you have a really good understanding of system design, of typical defenses, then it becomes way easier for you to, when you're looking at a system, again, from the outside in, most of the time is, okay, typically they're going to have a defense here, they're going to put something over there, how can I get around that? And so you know what to expect in a lot of ways, so it's easier to plan your way around things because you know what's coming.
Yeah, and I think the best offensive security engineers are always learning anyway, because new systems come on the scene, and so you have to do your research there. And so to really summarize this, we think it's a false choice to say, is it this versus that? It's just our personal take on what we think is a better starting point. I love both disciplines, and ultimately I do think it comes down to personal preferences in terms of what to focus on. But even if someone is focused on the defensive side of things, you absolutely want to be aware of what's happening on the offensive side. Otherwise, again, you're also sort of building defenses in a vacuum, and you're ill-informed about attack techniques. You also, as a good defender, you need to absolutely stay on top of what's happening on the offensive side of things. With that, we conclude the sort of the presentation part of this.